There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn, the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another episode of Zooming In, which I can no longer call a new series, but it's a fairly new series I've got going on my channel, where I engage with bookish social media luminaries the world over to talk about literary and bookish articles that I find online. And I'd like to welcome back for his second appearance, by popular demand, Bob the Bookerer, joining us from
Hello.
London. Hey, Bob.
You thought you'd gotten rid of me. There we go.
We're talking about an article that has a very long title with a big polysyllabic word in it that I want to talk about. And the article is called "The Gamification of Reading is Changing How We Approach Books." And the author is Greta Rainbow, and it's published on a website called shondaland.com, which is Shonda Rhimes' website about all things artsy fartsy. Shonda Rhimes is apparently the creator of some famous TV shows I've never watched. Like, what were they, Bob?
Scandal was one of them.
Scandal.
And I've not watched these either. I should add.
Yeah, good. I feel much better. Thank you. Scandal and Grey's Anatomy.
There we go. In some ways, that ties in quite nicely to the article itself, right? Kind of the person who reads instead of watching TV. So
that's right. Absolutely. So, Bob, what did you make of this article?
I kind of enjoyed it. I thought it was some interesting discussion about something that you see it sort of floating around bits of BookTube or bits of Bookstagram or whatever every so often anyway, right? When people are saying, look, I'm taking a break, or when people say I'm breaking up with Goodreads, or, all of those sorts of things. So it's kind of interesting to see it kind of outside of that sphere a little bit. Obviously, it name checks BookTok and Bookstagram, I think.
Primarily focused on Goodreads, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Who wants to take a stab at defining the polysyllabic word in the title? Gamification.
I mean, I can have a go if you want, but I suppose it's seen a lot with other apps, and Duolingo is referenced in the article as well, which is a prime example of it, of taking some kind of experience, whether that's something around learning, whether that's something around noting what you've read, and kind of adding making it into a game in the sense of having achievements or points or levels that you clear, or some way of kind of turning that experience into a very numerical thing. So for Goodreads, that's often things around both the rating system and how many books you've read in a year, but that can also be the fact that there are numerical totals everywhere for so many bits. That can also be the fact that you can compare that against friends, averages, all of those sorts of things, which is always quite fun. But also quite problematized, as this article points out.
Yeah, I think it maybe my sense of this article is it doesn't problematize. Like, this is not these are first world problematizations. Not too serious. Right. I think the only Goodreads gamification championship I can claim in a head-to-head with Bob the Booker is that I'm probably currently reading more books than you. I'm at 44. How about you?
In fairness, mine, there are some that I need to take off mine because it's basically like I've read them, but I just haven't written the NetGalley review for them yet, so they're still up. But I think it says 20. In reality, that's 4.
Well, so I am the champion. All right,
there we go.
Every other category I concede, but
your way stresses me out quite a lot. Shawn, in some ways I feel like you exist as sort of a man of mystery, because it's like, what is Shawn actually reading right now? Is it one of these 44? Is it something else? Is this all a smoke screen?
Well, I can definitely say it's nothing else other than what's on there, but it's often, books sit there that I haven't looked at in 3 weeks, is the truth of the matter. I think this just gives us a good chance to talk about how we do and don't use Goodreads. So there's things that she problematizes that I maybe share her opinion and I avoid. So, for example, I do not set a yearly goal at the beginning of the year. I did it the first year I was on it, and then after that I thought, you know what? I don't need that. I don't want that. And I also, from that, at the same time, I decided to kind of be secretive about my yearly total. so as not to encourage this. And that's part of the
Yeah.
gamification, right? Who's read the most books? And I typically would have read more than many of people watching my channel, and I just don't want to encourage that because I think it's not really that healthy.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? Because I purposely put in a yearly target that I know I'm going to hit, like without trying. But at the same time, I realized that
like 422.
But I realized that also feeds the problem, right? Because then I'm another person who is on there with this amount, and like you said, that's not a goal to aim towards. That's very much a personal number, and if it's a personal number, there's probably no reason why I need to have it on there. I think the first year or two that I used Goodreads, I think I was a little bit more interested in that number, partly because that was sort of me coming back to reading after a little bit of a pause where I'd sort of been reading, but it was really incidental. Like I'd read a fair bit for 1 or 2 weeks and I wouldn't read for a couple of months, and so it was a bit of a comeback in that sense. And also by sort of strange happenstance, a friend of mine had sort of recently come back to it, and we were very similar in numbers throughout most of the year. So that's where actually that part of the article where it speaks about that kind of idea of a race or a competition really hit me, actually, because I think I suddenly felt, I wasn't necessarily changing my reading habits, but I was very aware of the number of books I'd read at any given time. And that didn't feel particularly useful or helpful. And I think, as sort of is hinted in that article and sort of mentioned a bit later as well, more explicitly, that does sometimes lead people towards, if numbers are the goal, then it can lead people towards opting for shorter books over longer books. And, there's a risk then that an 800-page book feels like a waste because you only get one book for that as opposed to 4 200-page books. And that's where it starts to become an issue, because then you're not taking each book by its own value and what it does, right?
And I'm aware of this tendency that I have to say, yes, I have a lot of these neuroses that she is writing about, but they're not because of Goodreads. It's just for a much loftier reason that I'm eccentric. So one of the things, for example, is I hate bind-ups. And so if I read a novella or a novel that's in a bind-up with other novels, I will always mark it as a single novel. And then if I read another one from the same bind-up, that'll be a second book. And I'm sure that part of that comes from this whole numbers game, but I think, oh no, it's just that I just think bind-ups are beneath me somehow. So
well, I also think that's quite useful though, on a separate note, just for separating out, like if there are 3 books in a series and one of them you like or dislike a lot more than the others, I think it's quite useful to be able to differentiate that. I mean, it comes into a wider thing as well about star ratings, right? And that being part of the process, which I don't think the article goes into quite in the same degree, but star ratings, I think,
talk about star ratings. How are you with this part of Goodreads?
Well, increasingly, part of me is wondering whether I just give them up entirely, because almost everything seems to get 4 stars from me. And that's mostly because I'm like, if I've mostly enjoyed it, 4 stars feels right. If I kind of have a few more issues with it, maybe 3. If I really loved it, 5. Very rarely does it fall outside of those. On the sort of bell curve of all of it, it's sort of hardly ever any 1 or 2, a few 3s, tons and tons of 4s, and then some 5s. And so it almost feels pointless, because my purpose in doing that is not to rate the books. And sometimes I hate the whole process of rating a book, because it feels quite churlish when here's somebody who spent an inordinate amount of time researching this incredible book, and non-fiction book, for example, where they've spent years and this is their passion, and I'm like, oh, it didn't fully work for me, 4 stars. It's sort of, that feels quite churlish, when actually, like, that's, I mean, there's no objective quality is not really an easy thing anyway, but like subjectively I've not enjoyed the book to that extent. So a star rating feels quite bizarre on top of that. But I think those things do factor in. I think the article talks a little bit about this need to feel like you've written reviews and you're seen as somebody who's read books and what have you. And I think that can factor in, where it's not only I've read the book, but also I have opinions, or I'm a discerning reader because I gave a 5 or a 2 or whatever. And sometimes I suppose that's the bit I more want to get away from it, because the thing I enjoy about BookTube is being able to, even if I'm only talking about a book for a minute and a half, is to sort of talk about the nuance of my feelings around the book, right? That I was a little bit confused by the way this book approached things, but overall really enjoyed it and thought it was a fun experience, or it was just an incredibly challenging read, but I think was worth the challenge. And those things aren't necessarily reflected in style ratings or in terms of just having a thing marked as read. So that's sometimes the complicated thing. Although I will stick up for Goodreads in the sense that, well, for any kind of tracking system, in that it's often very useful for me just to be able to look back and remember what I've read, or kind of, there was an author whose book I read recently, Richard Millwood, Man-Eating Typewriter, and I was really enjoying it, and the name kept on like sticking out to me, and then I just looked back on Goodreads and realized I had read something from him ages ago and hated it. Well, not hated, but had many issues with it. And actually that was quite useful, because I would have entirely forgotten that book ever existed had it not been for that. So there are reasons and purposes for it, but
absolutely. And for me, record keeping as a record of what I've read, and since I started my BookTube channel 6 years ago, I don't write reviews anymore unless it's a bail review, because I enjoy writing a good bail review. It's usually a one-liner.
Shawn bailing on a never.
I think you know Mark Nash.
Yes, yeah.
Mark Nash has done 2 reaction videos reading and commenting on my bail reviews. Entertaining, at least to him. But I used to write reviews of everything, and when you're doing it, I just don't have the time when I'm doing BookTube. Fair enough. But the thing that I would like to talk about now is who is Goodreads for? I don't think Goodreads is for authors at all, and they have no business being on there, or at least they have no business reading their own reviews. Or they deserve what they get. I mean, there's been famous incidents of like an author that showed up at a Goodreads reviewer's house and attacked them. That's a very rare thing, but I've far more common, although I don't think it's really common, but certainly I have heard of multiple instances of authors taking issue with bad reviews and engaging in dialogue, rather heated dialogue, with the Goodreads reviewer, and I just think that's really wrong. Yeah,
no, I mean it's a good question about who it's for, right? Because nominally it's for readers, but I think, as the article points out as well, it's, we can't divorce it from the fact that it's a review site attached to a sales company, a company that sells things. I think that's the tricky bit, right? Because it's not, something like Storygraph or some of the other alternatives exist solely as that thing, for better or for worse. And, there is something to be said about the fact that connecting it to a giant store of books is a logical decision to some degree, that, this book's getting a lot of traction, where do I go to buy it? There's a sensible thing there. It just happens to be attached to not necessarily the best sales place. But the kind of intriguing thing, I think, is, then if it's mostly for the readers, it doesn't always do what readers need it to. I mean, it's very underdeveloped, I think, as a site, which is why alternatives have cropped up.
Yes.
But also, I think it must be quite a weird place for writers themselves, I would imagine, to look back. And I mean, I've sometimes had authors reach out to me to thank me for when I've sort of really praised their book, or what have you.
Perfectly fine. Absolutely.
Yeah. But then I suppose with that comes, well, if you're looking at good reviews, you're probably also seeing some bad ones, and that's difficult to stomach. I will say, I mean, it's useful as a reader sometimes to have somebody say, like, when I felt particularly mixed on a book and I can't quite settle my thought on it, it's sometimes really useful to see somebody say, hey, look, I really love that this book is incredibly lyrical, and that's made me think, oh, actually, you know what, that's true, that's an aspect that I didn't really think about, or I hadn't thought about how it challenges this other thing or whatever. But then equally to see somebody who hated it just sort of saying, oh no, actually I found this character insufferable, or I found the narrative really problematic for whatever reason. I'm like, actually, those are the words I've been looking for. That doesn't have to be Goodreads, but that it's a service that's within it.
Sure, and that sense of community, or an easy place to access a whole bunch of responses to the book. The many for the many is the term she uses. I'd never heard before.
Yes.
I often will consult Goodreads reviews if I'm getting to a point where I'm considering bailing, and I'm thinking, well, I wonder if did this get better, or is this a common complaint about this book? And if I find enough reviews that echo what I'm starting to feel, then that'll give me added permission to bail. So, um,
Permission to
um,
bail.
I think that people use Goodreads differently. So I use it primarily to track my own reading and to, see what other people are reading. I always enjoy that, but I don't ever pay any attention to when the algorithm suggests a book that I might be interested in. And I don't think I've ever clicked on any of their new releases coming in the fall of 2023. I just, no, I'm not interested in
Yeah.
that. And I don't want to be influenced by that corporate algorithmic BS. So I just ignore it. I use Goodreads a lot for finding guests for my channel, especially
There you go.
bite-sized book chats. I just had a lovely chat with a new contributor who she should have her own channel. This lovely Scottish woman. Can't wait to get that one on my channel. But yeah, and I found her on Goodreads. So I've made friends from all over the world that way, bookish friends. So it's fabulous for that. But getting back to star ratings for just a minute, I have a very subjective scale that people just shake their head at me, because for me, anything less than a 5-star is not a very good book.
Right.
I use all the other stars from 1 to 4 to grade various degrees of disappointment with the book. So I give a lot of 5-star books because for me it's strictly emotional. I loved it.
Yeah.
That's a 5-star book. It doesn't matter if there's flaws or imperfections or whatever. If I loved the book, if the flaws did not detract from me loving the book, then it's 5 stars. And I won't go through all the stars, but yeah. So everybody has their own conception of what the star ratings are.
Right.
Do you pay attention when you're thinking about whether or not to read a book, or even how to evaluate a book yourself, to what the average star rating is?
I mean, I'd like to say no, but it probably does feature in some way. I think often it'll be if I'm feeling particularly mixed about a book and I can see there are other people who are a bit more mixed about it. I think that sometimes gives me a little bit more confidence to actually be like, yeah, I am actually feeling 3 stars here rather than 4. I think sometimes, I mean, I'll try to avoid looking really deeply at that until after I've read the book anyway, where I've sort of already made up my mind. I think I've seen it accidentally where, a book had a really low rating. And I think sometimes that drags you into reading the book with a lower expectation, and equally if the book's, if everyone's giving it 5, I think that can warp how you perceive things. And I think actually that's an interesting part of the gamification that I think you were touching on there, that because everybody has their own different ways of why something's a certain rank, right? I probably skew higher than most people in terms of how I rate things, partly because for me as well, it's sort of like, it's mostly emotional. It's also mostly like, hey, this is a good and very decent book and I enjoyed this experience. Whereas I've seen, some people's reviews, and obviously it's fair, it's their thing, where they've been like, 3 stars, would have been 4, but I didn't like this character. And, where actually that wouldn't have changed the star rating for me because I'm quite comfortable with disliking characters. And so, but I do wonder in terms of the gamification aspect that because there is a risk, and this kind of is for everything, right? But there's a risk that we very easily boil down our opinions on these complex pieces of work into that. I find this most difficult with classics, actually. Modern novels, I'm a lot more comfortable with the sort of with how I might rank based on how I'm feeling. But it feels quite weird sometimes when it's something like Jane Eyre, and you're like, does it feel like a slap to the canon if I give it a low score? I mean, I did enjoy Jane Eyre, but like if I hadn't, would I, it feels very strange for this sort of big, impactful piece of literature to be like, oh, I didn't really like it. But these books are far more complicated than that, right? And we can't write 4,000 word essays for every single book we read, obviously. But it does sometimes feel like there's a risk that we lose some of the nuance behind some of these books. That a 4-star rating for Jane Eyre might be for very different reasons that I might give a 4-star rating to something else. If it's purely a numbers game, it's a bit of a strange one. It also sort of, for me, some of that gamification feels a little bit like some of the the problems that I sometimes find with being with how BookTube influences my reading, in that sometimes there is an element where, you know, I'm near the end of a week and I just think, oh, well, I'll quickly finish this book so I can, you know, cover it in my weekly reads. Whereas otherwise I maybe would have given the book another couple of days, or I'm a bit more mindful at times about my reading of a book, because I know that I'm going to have to review it in some form, either as a Goodreads rating or on my channel. And I think there is some element where that can be really positive, where that encourages you to think more deeply about your engagement with the book. Like, am I, you know, what is it that I'm really enjoying? What is it I'm struggling with? But there is some risk that that then becomes a consumable product, where it's sort of, let's churn out my reading because I've got some Goodreads to do. I've got some videos to make. You know, it's, and I try to resist that as much as possible, but it does creep in if reading becomes not necessarily just a status thing, but if reading becomes a thing that's the external show of reading more than the reading process itself. You know, I often really love it in book groups I'm part of, where the book that we're reading is maybe the one book that somebody in that book club has read that month. And so for them, they've really spent time with the book. They've really pored over it. They've, you know, spent 20 minutes going back over one page, or that, you know, they've read it in snatches here and there, or it's kind of really consumed them in a big way. Whereas sometimes for me, I'm like, I'm really sorry, that was 10 books ago. I can't actually remember it that well. And actually those are very different experiences of reading. And sometimes I feel like that's part of the problem, you know, potential problem with either kind of gamification or consumerism around reading, that it kind of becomes a thing you do and then move on from very quickly, as opposed to living in.
The controversy that has gotten a lot of attention, and she does touch on it in this article, that Goodreads has engendered of late, is where there's a pile-on, or there's some kind of it's also a phenomenon that has happened often on Twitter, where the masses descend on an author, or in this case an author, and the example that I've never spoken about publicly, so I'm a little nervous to bring it up, but Elizabeth Gilbert, she withdrew a novel earlier this year because she got so much pushback from, allegedly, a whole bunch of Ukrainian readers that she had set her historical novel in Siberia, in Russia. And she decided, on the basis of that, Goodreads, there was a whole bunch of, whether these people read the book or not, I don't know. That allegedly most of them had not read the book, but they just piled on, giving 1-star reviews and criticizing her on Goodreads, and so she withdrew the book from not to be published. Until I know how much of that is true, I mean, you know, who these people were, but I'm not a big fan of those pile-ons. Do you have any comment on it?
The pile-ons always feel kind of strange for me, because I think, obviously, in most cases it's a thing against the author, but it, you know, Goodreads is a platform where any attention is good attention, right? It's an algorithmically driven thing, so more people rating a book is a positive thing, in the same way that sort of polarizing figures on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, every comment or like or share is engagement. And so for the algorithm, that's positive, whether that's somebody telling the person to go and die, or that's somebody saying loved this post, you know. So I think in the midst of all of this, something like Goodreads does well out of it. Like that's clicks, right? That's, you know, the attention economy kind of benefiting from that. And so it's interesting, particularly because the article also speaks a little bit about that attention aspect, that the idea of being somebody who detaches from some of this.
So she ends, like you've alluded to, about kind of taking your reading offline. She says, perhaps I should try something. Read a good book, random book, and tell no one. So do you have a secret reading life that is not doesn't show up on Goodreads, Bob?
I mean, I don't know where I'd fit it in, really, in honesty. There are some books that I'll read and I don't have particularly strong opinions on. So I might rate them on Goodreads, but then I might not speak about them on my channel, only because I'll really struggle to put my thoughts together. And rather than me just sort of, for a minute, just be like, it existed. I just feel like I don't need to cover it, particularly if I felt particularly ambivalent towards a book. Nobody needs to see me just being ambivalent for 2 minutes. I could just, or like negative, unless, you know, I think it needs to be aired. So typically I don't. I'm kind of excited because I'm about to go and like I'm on holiday next week at the time of filming, and so I'm going to take some books with me that I'm going to go and read, and I'm aware that I will be talking about them, well, posting probably about them on Goodreads, probably talking about them on my channel. But then part of me is almost tempted a little bit to just have a couple of books that are just for me, that I just read, and I don't have to have any opinions on them, at least publicly shared ones. I can just read, I don't know, a book about, I mean, one of them is literally about like it's someone talking about cruising, like from a sort of sociological perspective. So I'm like, actually, you know what, sod it, I'm gonna read that. I probably won't even be able to talk about it on YouTube without YouTube getting a bit antsy, so sod it, I might just read. I mean, I've now announced it, so you know, therein lies the problem.
You heard it here first, people.
But like, it's sort of, it's kind of, it is strange because occasionally I do crave having those books that I read a bit more for myself, or, you know, I might read them and just mark them as read on Goodreads, and I'm leaning towards wanting to do that.
This was a fun chat, Bob. So my parting comment, I didn't know if I'd be able to come up. I don't think I'm going to end on a zinger, but I want to wish you a happy vacation and enjoy reading all that porn.
It's not porn, Shawn. It's
okay.
It's like it's a sociological thing about the history of cruising. It's, anyway, I don't need to justify this. I could be on holiday reading Mills and Boon and it doesn't matter. But there we go. Thanks for that, Shawn. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, Shawn. Bye-bye.